Good evening, dear colleagues. What an honor and privilege to stand before you tonight and to say a few words. I've just returned from Harvard, where I've spent a year as a previously important person, but more seriously, as one of several human beings on a quest to find a way to change the world so that we can live in the world of our dreams, as the center is doing. Lorenzo, Prince, and the entire group from the Center for the Study of Governance Innovation, thank you for the work you're doing. And it is really an honor and privilege to be included. We need new lenses to see the world that we live in. Most of the times we complain, but nothing changes when we complain. I am going to introduce our remarkable speaker and talk a little bit more about there is an alternative to complaining. What I like about this gathering and what you've been doing throughout this week is that you're part of those people in our troubled world that have decided it's no use complaining. That capitalism was given a human face because people like Karl Marx did more than complaining. They analyzed their world then, and they came up with ideas on how it could be changed. Perhaps they were a little bit extreme, as some of the books that Lorenzo has written. But it takes people pushing us to the extreme to find middle ground. But just sitting there and saying we live in a troubled world, nothing is working, doesn't take us out of the troubled world. So I honor all of you for the work you're doing in analyzing what's wrong, what have we done wrong, what have we done right, and how do we move forward? And I think that's the spirit of the entire Center for the Study of Governance and Innovation, and that's also the spirit behind the We Africa initiative. When I tweet about social justice and socio-economic inclusion, I'm lucky to get 250 favorites, and I'm lucky to get about 40 retweets. When I write about who's corrupt and who's messing up our world, within hours, I have had at least 2,000 approvals. What does it mean? It means we find it easier to point fingers at the people who are doing something wrong. And that's good, because somebody has to tell us that you're doing something wrong. But what we need is a multiplication of the kind of people in this room and the kind of people like our keynote speaker or our lecturer today to actually do something about changing our circumstances. That could be in rolling up their sleeves to make the change, or at least come up with ideas, as people like Marx, Frantz Fanon, and many other philosophers did. They came up with ideas and said, this world is messed up. Here's an alternative view. And we didn't have to take all of it, but we moved forward because they gave us some of those lenses. But what's the mistake we're making when we don't care about social justice issues? When we don't respond to issues of socio-economic inclusion? The reality is, as long as there is injustice somewhere, there can't be sustainable peace anywhere. As long as there are those people in Libya that we've just heard about who are suffering, we can't have sustainable peace wherever we are, because that's going to come back to haunt us. As long as about 300 people get killed in Egypt, Somalia, and many other places, and we don't do so much as even just tweet about it. We're contributing to a world that's going to come back to haunt us. A young Christian man in America many years ago wrote a poem, and this was in the 60s, about 6 persons trapped by happenstance. It was cold, it was dark, it was at night. Each one of them had a log or a piece of wood in their hand. The first one looked around, saw somebody not from their church, and thought they would not let them benefit from their log. Another saw somebody from a different color, different race, if you like to look at it as race, and decided, no, I won't let somebody from a different race benefit from my log. Another looked around and saw somebody who was poor and said, the lazy poor, they're not going to get to benefit from my log. The poor person, not seeing, not knowing what the rich person was thinking across the fire, the dying fire, decided, I'm not going to save this fire because this filthy rich person is going to benefit. A person who had been historically disadvantaged and exploited looked around and saw these people who belonged to a group he believed were part of the beneficiaries of the previous exploitative regime. He decided, no, I'll keep my log. They can't benefit again. And the last person, a mercenary who had never done anything in his life but for benefit, looked around and saw these sorry souls and said, they're not going to pay me. I better hang on to my log. James Patrick Kinney says, they did not die from the cold without. They died from the cold within. You people who are in this room and many other colleagues are part of that group in the world that has decided we're not going to die from the cold within. We are going to light our candle to banish the darkness. The Center for Governance Innovation has decided it's not enough for me to sit in my little corner and light a candle to banish the darkness. And you light yours in Sierra Leone, you light yours in Egypt, and somebody lights theirs in Mozambique. They've decided we need to connect the lights, because when the lights are connected, they have a critical mass that can make a huge impact against the darkness. And I believe that's the spirit of us being here, and I believe that's the spirit of why we have our keynote speaker today who's going to give us this lecture. She's young, very young. For me, it's not usual to come to a major event and have a young person talk to us, a multi-generational group. There's one place, though, where that happens, One Young World. At One Young World, counselors like myself, Meghan Markle, who's now going to marry the prince, and many others, Bob Geldof, our job there is not to do the speaking. Our job there is to listen to the young people privately first, and then go to plenary and introduce them like the rock stars that they are. Because young people are no longer tomorrow's leaders. They are today's leaders. And the truth is they've never been tomorrow's leaders anyway. If you think about the philosophers who changed the world, all of them were below 35. Frantz Fanon, that many of our young people look up to, was only 35, I think 33 by the time he died. But he had had amazing thoughts on the world. Jesus, those of you who are Christians, but you can also not look at Jesus as a Christian, you can look at him as a leader. He was 33 by the time he died. And he had fundamentally and phenomenally changed the way we see life. And just I'm talking now to those who may not be Christians, just looking at him as a human being who walked this earth. He fundamentally changed as well. So the leaders we've been waiting for are right here with us. And Mallence BartWilliams is one of those leaders. When I showed her profile to my daughter today, Wenzile, she said, "Oh, I know this woman." And she was very excited, and she spoke to Mpho, or Skibiji, sitting right next to her. I said, "I know her, you must know her." And they spoke and said they know her speech from TED Talks. And they remembered exactly what she said on her TED Talk about poverty and why Africa should not be poor. But I don't want to steal the thunder. I just want us to know right now that we will be graced by a great young person. She is Sierra Leonean. She was born in Germany. She's a social entrepreneur. She's involved in publishing, filmmaking, fashion, Ayurveda, writing, philanthropy, and many, many other things. She's pursued her studies in economics and finance in Paris, Singapore, and Great Britain. Today, she's involved across the globe in various startups that are producing holistic body care in line with her colleagues in Asia. One of the things that she's going to be talking to us is her philosophy around from charity to charity. And that's in line with what we've been discussing throughout this week, the whole question of a well-being economy. In other words, a world that works for all of us, democracies that work for all of us, because if those democracies don't work for all of us, those for whom things don't work are not going to take it lying down. As though provoking critics, her keynote during conferences and at TED Talks in Berlin, University of Oxford, and University of St. Gallen, and University of Namibia, they stir conversations about social justice and the challenges of the status quo. For me, there's resonance there because my work currently is around social justice. And throughout my life, my work has been around creating a world that is inclusive and that gives everyone a fair chance in life. Her recent initiative, the Africa Idea Factory, provides African innovators with a platform that fosters ideas, and as a change agent, she seeks to transform Africa. Mallence, thank you for the privilege of listening to you, and thank you for choosing to come back to this continent and make a difference. Over to you.
Good evening. Thank you very much for having me tonight. It's a great honor. I always enjoy coming to the continent and addressing people here. So tonight it's my first time speaking in South Africa. The reason being I will explain later on, after having been invited several times. I feel especially privileged to be here tonight during a conference that addresses well-being, the well-being of society and well-being economy, as Lorenzo has chronicled in his book, because I believe that if we progressively wish to move forward and hand over a society and a planet to our future generations that have substantial things to yield, then we need to exactly look at these factors. And I would say from my research that probably 95% of societies and nations in this world overlook the most important factors. You know, everybody's focused on natural resources and the exploitation and extraction of such, and most people forget the human resource, the most important resource, the protection of such, and the support of such. So tonight I wish to speak about my perspective, how I look at it, and how I look at it as a German African person, as a person that is the embodiment of Europe and Africa that met in, so to speak, in love and created me. And I also perceive myself as the embodiment of the future, because in the future everybody will look like me. At towards the mid of the century, the majority of people will live in Asia and Africa, and by the turn of the century, probably 80% of the world will have my shade, my color, and I look very much forward to a colorful world where prejudices no longer exist. So basically tonight we talk about well-being. What does that even mean? You know, for most of us, we might have different definitions. To some, that may be economic well-being. As the previous speaker addressed, there's a lot of people that seek out this economic well-being and put their lives at risk in Libya, in states that flourished under previous leader Gaddafi, that unfortunately was assassinated not too long ago. And I feel that's also one of the underlying issues that led to this present state. So what does that mean? I mean, well describes the notion of fulfillment, happiness, satisfaction, balance, and harmony, whilst the verb being describes the existence that is not limited to an individual. Thus, the term well-being sets forth the notion of a collective state of well-being, that of all beings, humans, plants, and animals alike. Thus, how is such a harmonious state attained? I looked at many nations on this globe and asked myself if there are any tangible models that could serve as a blueprint. Whilst we have a strong social system in Germany that ensures the economic well-being of all citizens, it fails to account for happiness of citizens, and depression and burnout are common factors. Likewisely, while Scandinavian countries are considered peaceful, progressive societies with high living standards, they simultaneously experience relatively high suicidal rates. Thus, overall, the most outstanding models for progressive well-being societies and well-being economies I came across were the Bafokeng Kingdom and the Kingdom of Bhutan. The main goal of the small Buddhist kingdom of Bhutan is the happiness of its citizens. It is even written in the ninth article of the Constitution. To quote the Prime Minister of Bhutan, His Excellency Tshering Tobgay, slowly but surely, governments are accepting that the solution to happiness and well-being clearly lies in changing the very purpose and goal of development. So they even measure the happiness via gross national happiness product. It's a holistic and sustainable approach to development which balances material and non-material values with the conviction that humans want to search for happiness, which is measured in 4 categories in the state of Bhutan. Good governance. There we come back to Thuli. Good governance is considered a pillar for happiness because it determines the conditions in which Bhutanese thrive. Sustainable socio-economic development, preservation and promotion of culture, very important, and environmental conservation, also very important. And ultimately, I believe that's why we're all here, you know. We all want to be happy. Of course, we believe that happiness is fundamentally sought out, or that material wealth can deliver happiness, but the ones that have attained such wealth will come to the conclusions that it is not happiness. And often we find the happiest people in the most basic circumstances, living the most basic and simple lives. So that is proof in itself that happiness is not attained by materialistic wealth or greed. The Royal Bafokeng Nation, it's just next door, it's a platinum-rich kingdom. And it also serves as an example of a functioning well-being economy. The king envisions the RBN as a world model of social capitalism, and me, myself, I'm a great activist and perpetrator of ethical capitalism, I coin it. So our visions are pretty much aligned, and they use portfolio profits to underwrite the Bafokeng's socio-economic development. In pursuing this vision of creating a self-sustaining community, the Royal Bafokeng Holdings holds a holistic and long-term view when it comes to investments, portfolio management, and resource allocation. And the RBH, the holdings, exist solely for the benefit of the nation. The commercial and social investment mandates and strategies are very important, and the views and opinions of the people are key in determining the manner in which the portfolio is managed. So when we look at both nations, the people are their priority. It is not the natural resources, the precious minerals. It's the human resources that both value and focus on. And basically, mineral resources are used to empower human resource, not the other way around. So, whilst these are great business models, models of society, and models of well-being economies, and could lead the way forward, and especially in the case of the Bafokeng Kingdom, which is a society that's very similar to other African societies, but it is a neighbor of South Africa, so it almost serves as a pilot. And it's a business model where a wealth fund is group owned, you know, by members of the nation, and earnings are channeled back into the socio-economic development of the Bafokeng people. And this example of an economy shows that it's possible, and it's, however, rooted in the principle of equal rights and communal benefits of natural resources, as opposed to economies that are rooted in the principles of exploitation of natural resources and the human resources. And I believe South Africa also serves as a perfect example among many other nations for such a narrative, especially considering the history of this country that was founded basically with the motivation of exploitation. So when I was first invited to South Africa in 2012 to partake in a project, I was skeptical, because whilst many Germans would rave about how beautiful this country is, like a Germany under the sun, like a home away from home, I always had mixed feelings that stemmed from witnessing the inhumane and incomprehensible system of apartheid as a child on German television, where people that were related to my mother and I would murder people that were related to my father and I. And Rest assured, it really traumatized me a great deal as a child. And it was a trauma that lasted all the way into adulthood. And I could not bring myself to visit this beautiful part of Africa, as my spirit completely rejected the system that prevailed. So when invited in 2012 by a German friend who ran a project in one of the townships, I reassessed and then stumbled upon the Marikana Massacre that had just happened, where miners were gunned down for protesting for a couple of cents more per day in order to feed their families. I came to understand that the Anglo-Saxon company that was behind the massacre capitalized over $1 billion revenue in Europe. Again, my spirit was repulsed and I was unable to visit. Instead, my trauma was reinforced, trying to come to terms with this level of injustice in the 21st century. In 2016, I was invited to shoot a documentary here in South Africa titled, "Whose Africa Is It?" This time I came, whilst becoming ever more disturbed as I conducted interviews with major stakeholders, as well as Africans who remain depraved of what was rightfully theirs to begin with. My confusion, rage, pain, and disappointment grew. However, my plight was nothing in comparison to friends that I made here who still mourn the death of their family members that go unaccounted for. This is not well-being, and it never will be. No matter how many rainbows we paint in the sky, it will only be colorful for those that have access to the beautiful holiday homes along South Africa's beautiful coast, and will only be profitable for the ones who participate from the aftermath of the bounty of the piracy. So whilst most of you commemorate and applaud South Africa for what, in my perspective and opinion, it is not and never will be, I personally have a very different perspective. Because I look at the United States, and 500 years after slavery, there's not peace. So wishful thinking may be with you for the next 400 years post-apartheid to await something that cannot grow on toxic ground. Today we witness the aftermath in the United States that also is a society that stems of different cultures, origins, and so on. However, what we have to realize that as of today, Germany is the only society that has successfully dealt with the atrocities that have happened in the country, and should serve as an example for nations across the world that are genuinely interested in well-being, economy, and society, and not simply the feel-good effect of the sound of it. While someone must add, Germans have perfected the blind eye when it comes to their genocides in Namibia and other parts of Africa. So while for many of you, well-being is a state, a wishful state, that you believe you bring about by formulating progressive models, more than 50% of the world's population feels very different about this. And they will feel increasingly different about this as long as we wipe this under the green carpet and attempt to plant something that ought to flourish on that very same carpet. And let it be told by someone that is interested in the reconciliation between Africa and Europe like no other, because I embody that, Africa and Europe. So the majority of the world's population feels increasingly different about this, as they are increasing in voice and number, and we shall not shy away from addressing this collective feeling, nor shall anyone that cannot relate take the liberty to tell anyone how to feel, myself included. And I believe there's not one melanated person on this planet that cannot relate to what I'm saying, because trauma is hereditary. And whilst many are uncomfortable to express it and instead succumb to the tone set by European leaders, such as French President Macron, who's presently on an Africa tour, insisting that the colonial past shall no longer define relationships, it should be taken into account that most economic relationships contractual agreements, and even entire industry in Africa and abroad exist as a result of colonialism. This is a fact that people can choose to embrace or choose to ignore. However, as long as they choose to ignore it, it will inevitably catch up with them once the power dynamics have shifted. Towards the middle of the century, Africa is expected to amount to the world's second largest population, after Asia, while Europeans across the globe will merely account for 9% of global population, meaning Europeans living as Americans, as Australians, as South Africans, as Brazilians, etc., according to UN reports. In this context, I wish to quote my former TED Talk. In nature, any species that is overhunting, overexploiting the resources they depend on as nourishment, natural selection would sooner or later take the predator out because it offsets the balance. Balance being the very prerequisite for well-being in any society. These UN reports have not factored in the results of global warming and the increased skin cancer mortality rates experienced by Europeans living in Australia and Africa, which geographically includes Israel, which presently has the highest skin cancer mortality rate in the world, followed by Europeans living in Australia and South Africa. This will bring about a demographic movement of Europeans back to Europe in the near future, just because the environment poses a death threat. In the same manner, we will also experience a demographic movement of Africans in America because the government and the environment poses a death threat. So basically, we will be perceiving demographic movements due to various factors where people feel that their livelihood is threatened. So well-being will no longer just depend on economics. And by 2000, basically the turn of this century, over 80% of the world's population will live in Asia or Africa. Especially in Africa, we're dealing with a relatively young population. A population and generation full of ideas and innovation. A generation rooted in progress because they grew up as the underdog. They will reap the benefits of the advantage of the underdog. An entire generation that grew up facing obstacles, and through facing obstacles built a muscle, through facing obstacles tapped into innovation as basically a result of necessity, and turned into borderline magicians. And we can see these young, talented innovators in all corners of this continent where they basically come up with ideas and conjure energy out of thin air. So basically, 80% of the world's population will thrive in these environments in Asia and Africa. And this generation is rooted in progress. It will be rooted in equality and, above all, of course, innovation. And it's also a generation that will rewrite history because they have the means to do so through tablets, through iPhones, through social media. And it's an era of transparency that we're all entering, and that's why I believe I can address that is often bringing about discomfort among people in a setting and in an audience like this. And the new generation doesn't shy away from having these conversations because they have them as we speak with everybody from all corners of the world sharing their plight on social media. That's why we know about things like slavery in Libya, because there's a big movement. So we basically are witnessing an entirely new era where communication is a given and honesty is a given, because we can no longer cover things up. And I am very hopeful of that generation because it will be an era that's transparent, and it's also an era that's free of racial injustice, free of sexism, free of religious division and greed. And it's a generation that will be as colorful as can be because we'll all blend. And it's a generation that is full of brand new ideas, and ideas that we cannot even envision and think about. And hopefully a generation that will remember values that may sustain harmony, equality, and respect. And we do have these values in our ancient African cultures, as well as ancient Asian cultures. Values of balance, where the environment is respected, where nature is respected. We have it strongly in Buddhism, and we also have it in ancient African cultures, where men and women ruled at par, and there was equal balance between the sexes, and also in conjunction with nature. And this is probably going to be the society that ensures that the well-being of all beings is guaranteed. And on that note, I would like to end. And I would like to invite you to support that new generation in their endeavors to be a better generation. And it's a generation that has great compassion. We see it in the rise of different movements, whether that's the compassion for animals, whether that's the compassion for the environment, and whether that's the compassion for different races, different genders, different people. So thank you very much for having me, and I wish you a wonderful rest of the evening.